Good morning, everybody, both here in Ireland and internationally, particularly in Europe. And hopefully those who haven't yet joined us can at least hear me. So good morning to you all. I was appointed by the Irish government as the Just Transition Commissioner for the Midlands almost 12 months ago on November the 8th. It arose from a decision by our national energy provider, the ESB, a state company, not to contest the decision of An Bord Pleanála to cease peat, the use of peat for energy purposes in two Midland power stations, Loughrea Power and Shannonbridge. That gave rise to an immediacy of decisions by the government on the basis that what had been planned for a 10-year transition to closure now had to be completed within 12 months. So that was an enormous challenge. I had been given terms of reference by the government and a reporting period of quarterly reports to the government on my engagement. The key concerns, I think, at that stage was the protection of employment in the region, particularly around Bord na Móna and the ESB, who were the two major employers affected. And secondly, to ensure that whatever measures were being adopted by the government would have local buy-in, local engagement. And one of my primary objectives was to engage with the local community, with local interests, with local businesses, with state agencies in the region, with the trade unions involved representing workers, and also with Bord na Móna and with the ESB in particular. I commenced that work last November and continued it right up to early March when COVID-19 led to a national lockdown. I think I was lucky in the period that I had started the engagement as the initial step. So I was involved very heavily in meeting a lot of local organizations, employers, state agencies, as I said, trade unions, and engaging in widespread consultation in the Midlands. I also undertook the opportunity to visit a considerable number of both the ESB power plants to meet the management and unions, and the same throughout the Bord na Móna network in the Midlands, meeting management, unions, and local interests. So in a sense, one of the primary points I would be making in regard to my presentation is the importance of local consultation, local engagement, local involvement. This is not a state-down activity. It has to be a local community, local region, upwards. I was also lucky insofar as there had already been a Midland regional transition team representing 4 of the counties in the region, particularly hard hit by this decision that had been working for some time, a combination of local authority, chief executives, chairman of local authorities, local and national politicians, and various social partners in the region and companies. I was also ably assisted by Sarah Morgan in the region and Jerry Finn and Michael Godwin, a senior and retired official of the Department of Climate Change, who were particularly helpful to me. And then, of course, our engagement with the Just Transition team in Europe, Robert Pollock and his team, who have been particularly helpful to us on the START programme of engagement with the local community and with the MRTT. I presented my initial report to the government in May of this year, my first progress report in April, May of this year. And in that report, I made 25 recommendations, which are being worked upon by the government. The response of the government was positive. They adopted the report and indicated an implementation plan would be put in place in regard to the recommendations I made. So that has been progressed through the department. Of importance also was the fact that the government had given 11 million specifically for Just Transition and a further 5 million for peatland rehabilitation and 20 million for retrofitting in the Midlands. My concentration was around the 11 million. So In regard to my report, I did recommend the extension of the area of interest from beyond the 4 counties to include Kildare, East Roscommon, East Galway and North Tipperary, where there were activities involving in particular Bord na Móna. As you know, peatlands and the boglands of Ireland just don't have country boundaries or river boundaries, so we had to take in those regions as well. The new MRTT, the newly reconstituted MRTT, has begun to function, and we've set up 4 working groups within that organisation. And these have now started to commence their work. We've been utilising the Zoom, Microsoft technology to initiate, start the work programme. And these are all representative of the local authorities, local communities, local agencies in the region, again involving people in the region around their own initiatives, their own activities, their own ideas. We have indicated 11 million for projects. As I said, the 4 working groups dealing with education, training and research. Second group dealing with employment generation. A third group dealing with employment continuity pathways, particularly about Bord na Móna and ESB workers. And working group 4 about community assistance and social enterprise. We did then send out for projects, outlined a call for projects in the region for the utilisation of this fund. We've announced the first tranche of 16 projects already, and the evaluation team set up by the department, we're working through those at the moment, and those will be completed hopefully by the end of this month, early next month, and we'll be in a position to have further announcement on projects in the region which will be funded from the 11 million. Our target is to utilise the full 11 million before the end of the year, and then have ongoing commitments on the implementation of those projects between 2021 and 2023. The big issues I felt myself in doing this is, apart from my engagement with academics, with the National Economic and Social Council, with the regional bodies, with the local authorities, was to create a whole of Midlands approach, insofar as one would build on the strengths that the Midlands had around a number of areas: enterprise, heritage, greenways, walkways, the utilisation of the natural habitat, the peatlands, the forestry, etc., the canals, the transport system in the region, the waterways, and of course the Shannon transecting the region as well between Leinster and Connacht. So it was really around building upon the resilience of the community, the enterprise of the community, both socially, social enterprise and private sector and public sector, involving the LEOs, the IDA, Enterprise Ireland, the local authority, and all the state agencies in the region, and then backfilling with that with the government departments, the Climate Advisory Council, the other government departments under the Department of the Taoiseach and their subcommittee, and getting them engaged in the report and in the recommendations of the report. I said the 25. So that is moving through. An enormous amount has been done over the last 10 or 11 months. Unfortunately, the outbreak of COVID prevented physical meetings in the region, but that didn't stop us getting on with what we felt was necessary to achieve, and is being achieved. Undoubtedly, the inability to travel in the region, as you will remember, 3 of the counties were in lockdown for a period, and then Dublin was in lockdown after that, and now we're in national lockdown again. So we haven't been helped in terms of the impact of COVID. But I think the structures in the region, the involvement of people in the region, the interest of people, the commitment of people in the region has been the mainstay of our activity, and continuing to ensure that we maintain and sustain just transition in the region through both local and central government approaches. What I would have to say is that the level of engagement, the level of interest was enormous. In fact, when we sent out our call for projects. We got over 100 projects, which is a considerable volume of projects from the region. And those who may not be successful, and I referred to points made earlier, we will be engaging with them so that the capacity they have, the interest they've shown, working with them to improve those applications for a future round of funding, possibly next year, so they're in a better position to build upon what they already had submitted and were unsuccessful. And of course, we'll be monitoring those successful projects, a lot of which are very interesting and very challenging. One particular recommendation I did make in regard to the region was making the region a hub for activity around renewable energy, and also the utilization of both the power stations, and particularly Lough Repower, as a centre for research, innovation, experimentation in renewable energy, and that we would use the opportunity of where our central core of activity around renewable energy would continue to be utilised. And there is a lot of private sector interest in becoming more involved around green enterprises in renewable energy. It's interesting the number of companies that have contacted me regarding investment in the region. And one of my recommendations was we would provide greater incentivization under either a corporation tax regime or our carbon tax regime to bring companies in the region that had green energy or green enterprise potential. I haven't lost sight of the heritage. The Midlands of Ireland is awash literally with heritage, to coin a phrase. It has great natural infrastructures, great greenways. The reopening of our boglands in the region are going to be a marvellous incentive to staycation in Ireland, to rediscovering the vitality of the region, the biodiversity of the region, and the great contribution both the ESB and both Mona have made in that region over 70 years. It's not a negative legacy. It has to be turned into a very positive legacy. And of course, central to that is ensuring that we have education, training, alternative work. The Board of Mona has now decided that it's no longer a peak company. It'll now become a renewable energy company and is engaged in a number of very interesting projects. The ESB itself is maintaining its national apprenticeships school in the Midlands. So we're going to be building hopefully upon that and upon the skills the workers have and the transferability of those skills in light engineering, in tourism, in retrofitting, etc. So that's very important. And I'm very keen that the third level academic institutions who are in the region and peripheral to the region, namely Maynooth University, Athlone Institute of Technology, Carlow, the Limerick Institute, and the University of Limerick will form a consortia. I've also recommended in my report, which is important, that all the local authorities will establish between them various consortia by which they would apply for regional and European funds and state funds to maximize the impact of access to those funds are in a number of directions that are made available from the state on an ongoing basis, but some new funds coming from the government's budget of this year so that they can work in tandem together rather in competition with one another. I'm conscious of state aid rules, I'm conscious of competition, but these are things I think we need revisiting, because if there's one thing I've learned about COVID looking through Europe, the state aid rules have gone out the window. We are making desperate efforts in Europe to sustain public transport, private transport, airlines, etc., enterprises, sustaining employment, all kinds of subsidies being given left, right, and centre to all kinds of private enterprises. So I think the rigor of those state aid rules need to be revisited. I think it's one of the challenges for us. One of the other areas I did say that needed some review would be the varying regulatory agencies nationally that can have an impact on just transition and the decisions being made. Those are the Environment Protection Agency, the on board Planola, our planning authority, and the local authority planning arrangements. Sometimes there's a confusion between these, sometimes there's lack of clarity, sometimes there's lack of uniformity, which has led to legal challenges, not alone in our own courts, but in the European courts, particularly around the complexity of European directives in regard to the natural habitats, natural environment, the use of fossil fuels. So quite a lot. The Midlands is, so to speak, a microcosm of all that can happen in just transition as it relates in the Irish context, namely peat harvesting, but could extend beyond that to other areas in Ireland where we use coal, biomass, etc., for energy purposes. In my report also, I refer to utilising some of the new incentives around electric use of public vehicles, private vehicles, and incentivising people to get away from the daily commute to Dublin. 25,000 people daily commute to Dublin, but that has been changed through remote working, the creation of business hubs, centres of excellence, maintaining the training and research output in the region and going into new areas. The whole retrofitting programme is not within my ambit, but a lot of exciting dynamic changes taking place there with the government's decision in the budget. The work being done by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland and other state agencies. I'm continuing my engagement with Bord na Móna, the ESB, Sustainable Energy, government departments, our own department, who have been very, very helpful in all of this, with the Midland Regional Transition Team about keeping the momentum going, keeping the ideas going, keeping the projects going, and not to allow COVID or other issues to override our singular purpose here of making and creating an environment in the Midlands by which people can study, work, socialise, holiday, sustain a living, build businesses in their own region so they can stay in their own region. There are bigger challenges, of course, in the context of climate change under the government's new programme, but I'm trying to keep the coherence around the Midlands rather than getting diverted into other areas, and to sustain and implement and challenge our own government to sustain and continue to fund the projects in the Midlands and in the commitments they made initially 12 months ago around support to the Midlands in a multiplicity of areas. There will be an implementation plan. I hope this will be out by the end of the year. There's also the contribution the Midlands and the MRTP will be making to our national territorial plan for submission to Europe. And then there's the ongoing decisions around the IDA Ireland, Enterprise Ireland and the LEOs to sustain, create, maintain, and incentivise employment in the region. Thank you. Is that okay, Sinead?
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you very much, Kieran. And my apologies for the technical challenges that we're all trying to move beyond. So I have a couple of different devices here that I've been trying out here. So Kieran, first of all, one of the thoughts that I was actually going to mention prior to the discussion was that the fact that so many people, particularly yesterday, talked about systems thinking. And I feel that, and moving beyond the siloed effect within government to addressing these issues. And you talked about this briefly just now in stating that the rigor of state aid rules needs to be revised. Can you just maybe make some additional comments now about how I think in the case that you presented is a good example of systems thinking and a good example of a broader approach? But how can we do more in relation to breaking down that siloed thinking and ensuring that we are that we have all the right actors engaged, fully engaged?
Well, Sinead, one of the things that emerged in my engagement with the local community, with local private sector enterprise, etc., was the amount of constraints they felt in putting forward ideas and projects and the limitations put upon them, either by a lack of multi-annual funding or a lack of support. But secondly, the issue that everywhere they turned, there was a new regulation or an old regulation, either generated by our own system of government, but more particularly by Europe, and always looking over shoulders about this. But we have to recognize now that the world has changed. It has changed dramatically. The economic metrics by which we apply our decisions to assist our peoples in support mechanisms have changed, have radically changed, and it's time for new thinking in Europe. And I think the general issue and the general umbrella of just transition, I think, brings these and marshals these together. There's no point in trying to encourage local communities to think radically or think big or have vision if they feel that when they start proposing certain projects, they're told they can't do that because it breaks state aid rules, or they can't do that because it's limited by competition rules. You know, we have to think in that awful phrase outside the box. Our economic world has changed, our social world has changed, and it will change for a considerable period. We now have to think the unthinkable. We now have to think new mechanisms by which we will work remotely. We'll have to think new ways by which we do our business, by how we socially interact. And if the last 6 or 12 months has taught us anything, and particularly since March, is that we're a very innovative people, that humans are very innovative. They have lots of ideas by which we can circumvent the crisis imposed upon us, not in an anti-health way, but in a positive way. Look at the online, the remote technology, the remote location. These will bring their own problem, but also the new ideas our social enterprises are coming forward with, the initiatives of our local communities to help each other. And what I'm really saying is just transition in its broadest sense should be facilitated, not restrained, by outdated rules that applied to another economic area that was only 12 months ago.
Right.
Okay.
So there's a lot of new thinking that's needed. And I think this will come out more, Kieran, in the discussion. So thank you for those good insights and really important insights into how much has changed even in the last 12 months. But to get a sense, as you said, how difficult or otherwise people are finding it locally, we move on now to Roisin Lennon and from Offaly, and I look at this Brendan O'Loughlin. So I'm seeing people here, but not quite on the screen as I might have thought. So I think I have Brendan O'Loughlin and Roisin Lennon here on the screen. From Offaly's local development company. And they had a really interesting local project, which was funded under the new Just Transition government fund, called Quality of Life, Place and Experience Project. So perhaps if we can hear from Roisin and Brendan right now, and that would give us an example of the challenges that people have and the opportunities they have in the local area. Brendan, can I hear you now? I'm not hearing Brendan yet. No, it seems like we might have problems with the audio from Roisin and Brendan. So I'm looking. I actually is that helpful? This isn't working. We may go on to Seamus Boland. I do see you on the screen, Seamus, and we look and see if we can fix the audio issues that we have with Roisin and Brendan. Seamus, can I hear you?
Sinead, I hope you can hear me. And that's me talking.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
So Seamus, with Rural Link, and I'm sorry we're jumping straight into this piece, but we'll come back to Roisin and Brendan shortly. But Seamus, you're CEO with Rural Link, and you have had some interesting experience in terms of getting a community group together around the restoration of the wetlands and the bogs there. So perhaps you could talk to us about that.
Thank you very much, Sinead, and to colleagues who are on the panel. Thank you, Kieran, for that very extremely interesting talk, because we have worked together in promoting the Just Transition Fund, which you so valiantly are chair of, and I'm so delighted that you are. I think from an Irish Rural Link perspective, our motto is sustainable rural communities. And we also have a link with the whole protection of bogs directive, which was the European directive. So we worked a great deal with many communities in terms of, there's an echo coming back, but anyway, we worked with a great deal with communities. Sorry, there's a lot of echo and feedback. Maybe there's something wrong. I'll continue. So Irish Rural Link, we've worked along with communities involved in making that transition from turf cutting to a different type of system. And that was a very painful transition because, as you know, in rural Ireland, the desire to, first of all, have your own fuel is very strong, but it's also, of course, quite cheap, and it allows low-income households particularly the opportunity to survive, as it were, in economic terms. So all of that meant a great deal of work was at that stage put in by Irish Rural Link. As a result of that, we began to look at the reality that the wetlands or boglands are seen as a negative. They're seen as something that are not good in the area, and if you live in such an area, you're disadvantaged in a whole range of ways, economically and every other way. So I suppose we started with being approached by members around the country, particularly Abbeyleix Bog, who have done an enormous amount of work in and making sure that the local site was in fact a positive and an asset. Hence the formation of the Community Rural Wetlands Forum. And really these, it's 21 members. Now that's 21 actual sites. These are places around the country, mainly the Midlands, but also down south as well, and west. These are places where the community have become involved. They're actually attempting in their own way, often with very few resources, to bring their local wetland or bogland into an area where it, first of all, is recognized. Secondly, it's seen as a place which can bring people to it, whether they be tourists or people studying the flora and fauna in that area. Because again, unique to the wetlands is, of course, the unusual and unique flora and fauna, and also the unique water systems that often exist in the area. So the hydrological situation is also important. But the key to making this happen is that each site is promoted and established by a local community. So instead of a situation whereby we tell people locally you should do this or that with your local bog, they themselves are coming up with ideas, forwarding them, developing them, bringing them to the attention of whether it's policymakers, grant makers, or whoever, in order to improve their own area. The great advantage of this is that whether grants come or go, and they do, as we know, they are now owning they are owning the local bogland. They're owning the site that's beside them, and instead of it becoming a negativity, it's becoming a positive asset in the area. And I think when you link this potential, and there is potential in the economic sense, in terms of tourism, and even in terms of attracting international studies and bogland studies as well. So there's huge potential in these areas to actually create jobs. Because remember, going back to our motto, sustainable rural communities, to me, sustainable rural community is a community with people. It's a place where people live and live in a reasonable, in terms of reasonable well-being, reasonable income, and reasonable futures. And that to me is making use of the local resources, whatever those resources are. And in, of course, the Midlands, the resources are massive, massive amounts of bogland, wetland, cutaway bogs, etc. And I'm hoping that the Transition Fund will look at developing ways and means to bring that to those boglands and wetlands to life. And one of the best ways to do that is to enable communities. Now, some people think that that's automatic, that that's easy. But community work, no more than any other kind of work, is something we have to learn and we have to develop and we have to get the expertise necessary to do so. None of us are born with the talent or the inherent talent to be anything, whether it be a community worker, a doctor, or a trade unionist or anything else. We have to learn it and it has to be managed and it needs certain skill sets. So Irish Rural Link have always said, because that's the strength of our organization, the communities need leadership, they need applied leadership, they need support, and they need the kind of training necessary to bring this about. It isn't easy because remember what we're talking about. We're talking about change, managing a massive change. We know that in the Midlands, the bogs were an enormously rich source of income. Many families, especially in my own area, I even worked on Bord na Móna in my time, were the beneficiaries of this as an asset. The big challenge now is to change, to bring the necessary change so that the bogs as they are now return the same benefits and advantages to the community. Otherwise, we lose. But worse still, we lose the diversity and the biological diversity which we need to develop. We know in terms of climate change, in terms of environment, there is a necessity to develop these bogs in such a way that they return to the kind of vibrancy that they should have, and also that assists the climate and assists the local environment. Obviously, assists the local communities as well. So Irish Rural Link are strongly promoting just transition because it is the way forward. We're strongly promoting the Community Wetlands Forum because it's not just a talking shop, it's 21 actual sites on the map of Ireland working every day to try and improve their situation. And because in this we see a potential of a minimum of 300 to anywhere you like after that. Look, we did a report on the map, in the map of Ireland, we actually established the possibility of across the country of 3,000 sites. That would deliver massive richness in terms of biodiversity, community development, community involvement, well-being, and economics. And I think we cannot forget that. All of those are linked in, and that's why we have been promoting it. So for now, Sinead, that's my contribution to this morning. I hope it's been heard in these trying times. And one thing I leave you with, one of our members basically was saying that during the last lockdown, the area, the wetland bog area that he had, found more people, or local people, by the way, using it as walkways and clearways and fresh air and all of that. So it has a health finding as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for inviting me this morning, and I hope that is of help.
That is great. Thank you very much, Seamus, and I do appreciate you jumping in there a little earlier. Probably some discussion to come up again in the discussion session later about this. But one of the questions that strikes me is you were talking about the potential for economic benefit here and the potential for studies. I'm just curious now about young people and how, if you're finding that the young people have a particular interest in studying this, and if you've noticed any trends in that area. It's a point we'll be coming back to later, but I just wanted to ask your thoughts on it right now.
Indeed, many of the sites already have attracted internships from people, young people doing degree level or further advanced studies in areas of biodiversity. And that can be anything from flora, fauna, water systems, and so on. So we think, you know, that we would like to see the encouragement of more universities getting interested in the uniqueness, especially in the Midlands area, of our various bogland systems. I think they require further study. Remember, it was David Attenborough who started all of this some years ago, and he showed that the potential in terms of understanding the biodiversity systems is huge. And I think for any young people listening, I think there is a huge career in this as well. And the boglands are right at the doorstep of those of us in the Midlands.
They are indeed, Seamus. Thank you. And it is, yes, not just David Attenborough, but maybe others are picking up on that too. And we heard that yesterday from Minister Ryan when he talked about the need to enable the youth to imagine a future that they could really thrive in for decades to come, rather than simply, you know, there's a job here and we might be able to manage those jobs for now. So it's about envisioning a future for our youth. So thank you for that. I'm looking online here and I'm still not seeing Brendan and Roisin back on. And I appreciate everyone bearing with us during these technical challenges. I think even though we're all learning the importance of place-based work and place-based processes, we're all in different regions right now, and we're having local challenges with connections. So I'm seeing Roisin and Brendan back here, and I'm going to try again and see if we can hear you. Can you speak there, and let's see if we can hear?
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
I'm hearing something. Can you switch up the volume?
We have the volume on the back here.
It's
Is that better?
very faint at the moment.
Is that any better?
Just slightly, but I don't. Can you hear it? Can others hear it? Well, I'm hearing it in a very faint way.
Can others hear me?
No, sorry, this is Megan from the technical team. You're very faint, Brendan. When Roisin was speaking with me earlier, she had perfect sound. This was before the session started. I'm not sure what the switch has been since then.
We're using the same laptop.
Okay, so we may have to go offline with that again to try and address that that technical issue. I'm going to look at some of the questions that are coming in from our chat, which may put to either Kieran or Seamus before can from Roisin and Brendan before we go to Hudiga from the OECD. But so let's see if we can I'll just put one of the questions that I have here about, and it's about capacity building. So what are the structures that we need in place to ensure better and greater capacity building long term, thinking, you know, 10, 20, 30 years out, the capacities that are there in the region. So I'm going to throw that question to Kieran and then to Seamus just while we're waiting to see if we can address the other audio issue. So Kieran, can you take that question? Can you unmute?
Yes. No, there's two prongs at the moment by which we're building capacity. One is the working groups, the 4 working groups I alluded to earlier and mentioned under the Midland Regional Transition Team. They all of these working groups have a high level of involvement from local authorities, state agencies, local communities, education and training boards throughout the Midlands region. We have made a very clear effort to involve the 8 counties involved now. So that will bring local knowledge, local experience over many years in many disciplines and in many areas and many locations to bear in one single contribution. And they have a work plan, they have elected chairs, they have a work plan, but they'll be working already this year, and we'll be bringing forward reports early next year, which will feed in to the capacity of people to access funds in a multiplicity of areas under government programs and European programs. The second area by which we're building capacity is through, as I said, the call we made under the START program and the Just Transition program for projects, and the 100-odd applications we got, most of which, in fact, will be successful once we've completed our final analysis and evaluation of these. And these range between employment, community, heritage, local involvement. So that is another stream by which we will be creating capacity, Sinead, in the Midlands region, working with Seamus's Rural Link as well, who is key in a number of areas, particularly around information, knowledge, and the radio webinar he operates. So really, it's communicating information, building the capacity, and I think somebody said it in an earlier session, I think it was Rowena, given the people who have ideas the capacity to build upon those ideas in the formula that's necessary to successfully put in projects. You know, it's almost formulaic sometimes, but if you don't have the formula and tick the right boxes, you don't get past the first round. So we will be building that there. So we have created in the Midlands a high level of expertise for access to funding. Area, the knowledge, the information, and the checklist that's necessary for that. And we'll be working there with these groups. And the next presentation will be will be one of the successes around the projects.
And
when
I,
we
I
hear
hope,
yeah.
I hope that the success is actually being able to hear from Rosie
Yeah.
and Brendan now.
I hope people can hear us. We've tried
well
it.
done, well done. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you to introduce the project and from Offaly Local, LDC as we call it, the Local Development Company. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Charlie. Sorry about the technical issues. I'm with my colleague Roisin here. We're socially distant and we're learning to be resilient in all sorts of things that Kieran has been referring to, and coping with the technology that challenges us. I suppose briefly what I wanted to talk about, we're following on from what Kieran has been talking about. I don't need to tell people about the impact of this in terms of the Midland region. As the local development company in Offaly, we're working very much at a community level, and Seamus has referred to that from a community development perspective and looking at how communities respond to this. And I think maybe 2 years ago, Sinead, you were at a meeting in Tullamore of the Midland transition team, and you talked about effective communities, which is something we got into a conversation after about. And really what we're talking about are the effective communities. Communities like Shannonbridge, where there's a power station with a population of 400 people. And when you close that power station, the impact of that is not just in terms of job losses, but it's in terms of a tradition. It's in terms of something that's being part of that community for 60, 70 years, where they've had all of this activity, they've had all of the footfall that type of industry brings, and the opportunity. So our process is quite simple, and we're very pleased to be able to do that. The context for it is that we have probably of the 8 counties that Kieran has named, and he will forgive me for wearing the Offaly jersey as we do all the time, is the most affected county is County Offaly. The statistics don't lie on that. The greatest number of job losses are in that area. Almost half of all of the jobs that will be lost in County Offaly. And the impact of that in terms of other services that communities and businesses within those communities would have provided are really important. So we started off, I suppose, about 2 years ago in what we call the community planning process. Now, it really is a bottom-up approach, and we hear a lot about bottom-up approach. This is probably as near to the bottom as you can get, because the methodology that we use in this is very much about finding out and engaging with the community at its most basic level. The local GA clubs, the soccer clubs, the women's groups, the parent and toddler groups, any group that exists, we make contact with them. So the premise for this is that there's a lot of talk within government. There's a lot of talk within Europe. There's a lot of talk about just transition. But in essence, what does that mean for a local community, and how does the community gain and benefit from that, and come up with strategic plans that aren't just about immediate things, that they're looking at 4, 5, up to 10 years ahead in some cases about things that they can do. So using funding from our own LEADER program here in Offaly and from the Social Inclusion program, we engaged in the communities. We went out at night times, we went out at daytimes, we went out to meet whoever we could meet, and we brought community organisations together, and we looked at, I suppose, the planning process that would concentrate on not what the community doesn't have, but what the community does have. And there are a huge number of positives. Kieran has talked about some of them, Seamus has talked about some of them, and it's about the resort that's there, and it's looking at, as one person in the community described it, as looking at either the bogs as an unencumbered landscape of beauty or a black hole. And what we're looking at is the positives in this and saying, where can communities come and develop that? So there are 4 key questions that we include in the planning process. And these are ones that kind of focus people's minds really quickly. And they are, what as communities can we do for ourselves? Okay? What as a community can we do to help others? What as a community can we do to help others? And what are the things that we would like to happen that are outside of our control? Okay, so if you put those 4 questions into the community planning process, they're very simple in some regards, because you deal with what the community can do for itself first, and that generally brings a good response there. And we've called this the ABCD model of development, and that's based on the asset-based community development approach. What are the assets that communities have? So the methodology that we use in this is we target the community network and the organizations and the key leaders that are in each community. So we bring them together and we outline the process of which they will take ownership and they will have responsibility. So they look at how do they consult with the wider community. They prepare a questionnaire which asks questions about what people feel they would like their community to be in 5-10 years' time. What are the things they would like to see happen immediately? What are the things they'd like to see happen in a number of years? And what are the things that they would like to become involved in? So a questionnaire is sent to every household. That's volunteers, collected by volunteers, and we generally get something between 50 and 70% response rate, which is fantastic. I mean, it's a real good sampling process that we have. We analyze that, and we do a similar one with the enterprises that exist in areas, and that could be the person that owns the chip shop, the pub, somebody who's making windows, whatever businesses that are in there. We get a list of all of them, and we find out what their needs are, and we're able to do that. We analyze that data. We do that here internally ourselves. We have software that we're able to do it. And then we do what we call a community mapping and resort audit. What are the resources that the community see? And we map those in very simple terms. We bring in whatever expertise that we use. And Kieran Lynch, formerly of Tipperary Institute, is a huge supporter of what we do here, and has helped us out in terms of maybe analysing some of the stuff within the communities and facilitating some of the work that we do. And when we have that done, we sit down with the communities and the people that are involved in that, and we articulate the proposition. What are we suggesting we can do? What are the strategic actions? And I suppose we create a linkage then between that and the statutory plans, the county development plan, the local economic community plan, any of the regional plans that would exist, say, for example, Bord na Móna's own plans, Waterways Ireland, any of the Fáilte Ireland plans that will be there. And I mean, moving on quickly onto the just transition piece, when you do that, and if you take these local communities, these are from populations of 400 up to about 1,800 people, okay? And they're all interconnected, and very often there's wonderful parish rivalries that goes back to football and hurling and soccer and all sorts of things that are there. But what we're trying to do under Just Transition is to get those to cluster their thinking and to cluster their plans, so that if they're looking at activities on the water, that there's a connection between towns like Banagher and Shannonbridge. If they're looking at pieces on the bog, that they're looking at walking and cycling towards. But you don't stop when you come to the parish boundary, you continue on to other areas. So that all of those plans are being aligned. And I suppose there's a population base then where you're looking at probably a population of about 18,000 people that are included in that. And what you're doing in that is you're looking at developing opportunities for individual communities that allow them to plan out for their own future and to reimagine what the world would be like. But it also brings you into other funding, because Kieran has quite rightly mentioned that, you know, there's 11 million this year. If I'm not mistaken, the applications that went in the first phase were for about 120 million euro. So there's a level of where you need to manage the disappointment for some people who won't be successful in that, and you need to look at the other directions, but you also need to be prepared for other sources of funding that should and could become available. And I would agree wholeheartedly with Kieran's point, is that, you know, we can't be beating ourselves up with rules and regulations in relation to these initiatives. So the clustering on that is that I suppose we're providing support for groups in the West Offaly area and in the East Offaly area, and these are the areas that are most adversely affected by the job losses, in terms of how the communities will respond to that. And I think, if I can say, and just in conclusion, there's a couple of things that we hang our hat on in this, and one is that there has to be justice in a just transition, and you have to go to where the impacts are most greatly affected. And while regional responses are absolutely necessary, and I would agree completely with them, I think that has to be translated very quickly into how you get to those communities, because before those communities are completely forgotten and die a death unbeknownst to us all. So thank you for that. Sorry about the technical issues. Thanks, Sinead.
Not at all. Thanks to you, Brendan, for helping us and for persevering and for being resilient in the face of those challenges. I'm actually going to put in a question to you just now before we go to our discussant, because it came in at the very start from someone called Patrick, and you've been touching on this point. In terms of sense of place, how challenging is it to pursue whole of Midlands approach to just transition when sub-regions, parishes, etc., towns are important sites of belonging? And I think you touched on that a little bit there, Brendan, and I'm just wondering if you have anything initially to say to that question. How challenging is it to think both of the wider Midlands region and yet honour parishes and, you know, the importance of rootedness in the locals and your local area?
Yeah, I think it's one that is that we questioned ourselves on in the whole clustering idea, that you need to be able to bring people. We were trying to find a commonality, and the commonality I think Seamus talked about was in terms of the peatlands and the place that it became a positive place, and that we were people of the bog. And there's a lovely book that was written many years ago called Bogmen Be Proud. And it's about the Boardmona communities. And if you come to Offaly, or if you go to Longford, or if you go to some of the other counties, there are whole communities that have been built around the peatlands. You know, they were built for that very purpose of harvesting turf. There are ESB towns and villages where people will still talk about the Boardmona houses and the ESB houses that were built back in the day. So I think it's a transitional piece. I think you need to work on it from a bottom up, rather than trying to give an image of this being, or we'll all be in this region. One of the difficulties, one of the great challenges of working in the Midland region is that the Midland region for many bodies is a different region. You know, that there, in some cases it's Laois, Offaly, Longford, Westmeath. In other cases it's, you know, if you work with Fáilte Ireland, it's a different part of Ireland. If you work with the communications companies, it could be Offaly, Tipperary, Kilkenny could be a region. So it's I think it's a slightly different and a bigger challenge for the Midlands than it might be for maybe the West, for example. So there's a very definitive base in your mind if you talk about the West, whereas the Midlands is the challenge. But I do think you need to start local and build it up. Sinead, would be my answer there.
That's a key one that's coming up in some of the chat questions as well about this bottom-up approach. So I think you've connected two important points here in your response there, Brendan. So I appreciate that in order to figure out how to honor both the local rootedness and look at the wider region, we have to start from the bottom up. And yes, every area is going to be different. So thank you for that. And thank you for explaining about your project, which I think is really interesting and bringing the region to life in so many different ways. So now I'm going to turn to our discussant, and I'm going to try and pronounce his name properly, Rüdiger Arend from OECD. So Rüdiger is the head of economic analysis, statistics, and multi-level governance at OECD's Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. I hope I got that right. You can correct me. But what I would like to hear from you now is, having listened to all of these discussions about what's happening in this particular place, in this case study, what are your reflections on the questions like what policies and measures are effective in supporting regions to become sustainable and resilient? So over to you.
Okay, thanks, Siad. I'm trying to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm trying to put on my my slides. So are they maximized now? Is everything fine?
Yes, I'm seeing them coming. Yes.
Okay, great. Good.
You could maximize your slides there, Rüdiger.
They are maximized. Yeah.
On our screen, we can still see your thumbnails to the left. So
yes, let's see if I use my PowerPoint. Let's see. I'll try to do PDF. Maybe then that works. Okay, I'm playing around here. I hope it works now. So let's see. Is this better now?
2 seconds, it's just coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. So basically what I'm trying to do is going to give a bit of a perspective from the international point of view. I'm working in the OECD, as was mentioned, in a part of the OECD which is particularly specialized in everything which is related to the subnational level. And where we're looking also specifically on regional development, looking at SMEs and then more generally regions and cities. And one of the important points when it comes to the just transition, and that's really something I wanted to show you because it's basically kind of like a bit of a background, is really, I mean, the investment we are doing at the moment is very far from being enough. I mean, basically, the blue investment bars are what's basically happening at the moment. The gray ones is what governments are committed to make happening. And the blue lilac ones are basically what we need to basically achieve the Paris Agreement targets. And as you're seeing, I mean, we are investing still far too much, even kind of like, I mean, on what theoretically governments are planning to do. We are investing still far too much in fossil fuel supply, and we're investing far too little in energy efficiency and in renewable power. And that's obviously a big problem because basically the later we act, the higher the costs will be and the higher the risks of global warming will be. And that's something I think that we've all seen in the COVID crisis. I mean, the countries who reacted very early, very quickly, I mean, have been faring much better than those who have been waiting. Basically, the longer you wait, the higher the costs will be. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Then the second point I wanted to make is really that regional local governments are playing a major role when it comes to to infrastructure investments. And they're having jurisdiction over crucial sectors for climate action. I mean, including, for example, buildings, transportation, and other local infrastructure. And they can also boost the circular economy, for example, in waste management. And more generally, they are responsible for 55% of the public spending in sectors directly associated with climate change. So basically, a large part, more than half of the spending and the investment in those sectors is being undertaken at the local level. And that really is why cities and regions and localities, municipalities are so important in that sector. And so let me get to the next slide. Okay, then I wanted to look a bit about what do we need in economic restructuring for making the transition to a zero net carbon economy happening. And here what is interesting, we've been looking at countries and large regions within countries. So for example, I mean, for you, that would be the East and the Midlands regions. And this is basically showing the share of the jobs which are basically at risk from the low carbon transition. And what you see is if you're looking at relative country level or at the level of large regions, I mean, the number of jobs are not that high. So actually from a national point of view, I mean, the impact on jobs from this transition is really not that remarkable. It's relatively low, especially given that it's over a fairly long point in time. But obviously, that doesn't mean that the regional level, and as you all know, I mean, the impact can be quite substantial, because if you're kind of like having 10 or 20% of your workforce being affected, I mean, this is really, I mean, devastating for you. But I mean, the point I really want to make, it's not a national problem. It's really a very localized problem. And that's also why it's so important to basically help those places where this local impact is strong. But it also shows in a way that it can be done, because it's not a general problem. It really is a very much localized problem. Then I mean, I've already been talking about COVID. And one of the issues we've been seeing is that places are differently affected by the transition to a zero net carbon economy, but that's also the case for COVID. And what we've been trying to see is kind of like when you are having a confinement, which are the regions which are most strongly affected from these economic measures, basically, that we're taking to fight the virus. And here you're seeing that the impact differs quite strongly. I mean, there's some regions where there's only 15% of the jobs that are potentially affected in such a shutdown, and in other regions it's kind of like, you know, up to 40 or even beyond 40 in some regions. Now you're seeing in Ireland, the East and the Midland is relatively strongly affected. So basically, I mean, not only do you have to shoulder the environmental transition, but I mean, also you also have a particularly strong negative impact from the COVID. Now, when it comes to the just transition, I mean, there's a certain number of opportunities and challenges that we have identified in the OECD. And I mean, obviously, I mean, this is, I mean, in a way, repeating from maybe a more higher up standpoint, a lot of the things we've been hearing this morning. And on the opportunity side, obviously, when you're investing in new sources of growth, then you can strengthen your regional resilience. Part of what needs to be done in this transition is the upskilling of the local workforce. You can have also a lot of well-being gains. I mean, there is a lot of co-benefits in the transition to zero carbon, and most of these co-benefits are actually not at the national level; they're at the local level. So basically, when the quality of your air improves, I mean that's basically of a benefit for the local community. And there's other co-benefits, and it usually is true that these co-benefits are really a local benefit. So that's also one of the reasons why for cities and regions it is important to kind of like achieve this transition. And what is also obviously necessary is that this transition be just, because in that way it can have popular support, and which is also, I think, needed, because in the absence of being just, I mean, it may also politically be very difficult to actually achieve it. On the side of challenges, one of the challenges obviously is COVID-19, because I mean we may be seeing too little investment going into the right direction at the moment. And also with the investment that is planned to stimulate the recovery, there may also be the risk that money may be going into kind of like quick fixes just to kind of like get the economy running again, and without consideration that maybe these boosts may be going into sectors which are not sustainable. So it's really important that these investments are strategic in areas that are conducive to the transition that we're all trying to achieve. Then obviously the demographics are not helpful in many regions where you're seeing outward migration and population aging. So basically when your labor force is shrinking and getting older, that's not really helping with reskilling and transiting to new sectors, but still that's something that is to be done. Then obviously, when you reskill your workers, I mean, you also need to have jobs that fit with them. So there needs to be like a comprehensive package. It's not just kind of like that you train your workers, but you also need to make sure that you're having the framework conditions and the investments in place, and basically the companies that are being created or coming in to make sure that these people actually can work in the sectors that they're being trained for. And then, but I have the impression that's less of an issue, for example, in the Midlands, is that you need social cohesion and network structures that are very helpful in achieving this transition. Because I mean, there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of partnerships needed, and that obviously works a lot better if people know each other, trust each other, and talk to each other. Then, if you take a bit more general approach on regional development, there is basically two ways that regional development policies can act. The first one, and that was basically what was done up to more or less 2 decades ago, has been a compensation approach, which was basically, I mean, if there's a region or a locality which is having economic problems, then let's give them some money to compensate the workers, to retire them early, give some compensation also for the firms, do a bit of subsidizing, get a bit of state jobs into the place, and kind of like, you know, compensate the region financially, basically. And obviously, I mean, that helped in the short term, but that really did not help for the development of those places. And typically it kind of like led to kind of like to be more of like a assisted, non-performing place. And so, I mean, that approach has basically been changed. And I think now it is generally understood that it's much more important to kind of like invest into a structural reorientation. I mean, to take the money to basically upgrade the workforce, retrain the workers, bring new jobs in new sectors, and have a better infrastructure and have a better innovation policy, and you know, all these kind of like positive events that need to come together and that then really kind of like help to make the place work again and make it to transition to a new economic structure, and then really kind of like to take off. And this is a new approach, and I think that's also what's really important in the transition that we are talking about today. And a lot of what I've been hearing this morning, I think, is really of the structural reorientation type, and so it has been very positive, I think. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on which is going in the right direction. Obviously, this transition is still very challenging, and as I said earlier, I mean, it's really important to kind of like anticipate, to act early, because that makes the whole transition less costly and more successful. And it is important, as I just mentioned, it's kind of like to make sure that firms and workers and regions reorient their sectors towards the new paradigm. And lastly, it's also important when kind of like doing this reorientation at the local level, it's to think about what are the specific resources, what are the specific assets of a place, and trying to build a strategy on the strengths of the place, rather than kind of like the latest fad, what everybody thinks is the new sector could come. It's much more useful to kind of really thinking hard what your strengths are and where you can make a difference, and where you also have maybe different in other places, and you can build on something. There's one caveat. We see in the OECD that there's a really very large number of local and regional initiatives in the OECD countries. But these current efforts to tackle a just transition at the subnational level, I mean, they often remain poorly integrated into national policy frameworks. And what is really important, I'd like to close with that, is when we're talking about the environmental and the energy transition, it's really important to link that with broader local economic development strategies. And that really is key to MAP4 success. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Thank you very much for your attention. And so I'll end my presentation and turn back to the normal screen, basically.
Thank you, Rüdiger. And I actually there on a point that is on a lot of people's minds. How do you determine and create better links between these national policies, which sometimes have impact in local regions, and focusing better on the local policies? So you've identified that as a challenge, and so maybe we can open this up into the general discussion, saying, well, what suggestions might you have about how we can improve that? Because as you said earlier in your presentation, this is a localized problem, and we recognize that. And you have many local actors here in this session. How can these local actors help to create better links between these national policies and still drive having stronger local policies that build the impact we need locally? So what can the local actors do on this? Or is it up to government actors to help improve those links?
I mean, this is basically an area that we call multi-level governance, and that in a way is kind of like how all the relations between the different layers of the government are structured. And that obviously is complex, it's different in different countries, and in certain countries it works better than in others. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Now, how you can improve that? I mean, the most important thing obviously is dialogue. I mean, you need to be dialoguing a lot between the different levels of government. It is useful if it is institutionalized dialogue, because if it's just because, you know, some people know each other and get along, that's great as long as they are there. But when they leave, then the whole thing may be breaking down. So basically having institutions of dialogue in place. So that is the general rule now, that obviously in different contexts has concrete different implications. But I mean, that's basically the most important factor. One of the specific measures that we've often encountered is that there is a very big gap between local politicians and national politicians. I mean, they just don't understand what the others are doing. And what can be very useful, and people who've been doing that, they also have been, you know, stressing that very often, is if people have been working in both administrations. If people kind of like at the national level have been working in a kind of like in a local administration, had a local job or something, they have a totally different understanding what the problems on the ground are. And similarly, also people at the local level, if they have an understanding how a national politics administrations function, I mean, they can also maybe assess more easily what is kind of like feasible, what is the way to approach such a national administration with a project or with a suggestion for financing that is more successful than another way of doing it. So I think this can be a very helpful situation when you have these individuals who have been working both sides, so they actually understand what the issues are on the other side, basically. Now, concretely, I mean, obviously, that's all things that you can't really change in the very short term, because it's more institutional, kind of like, I mean, building up, I mean, human capital and relations. But what you could try to do is kind of like just basically get as much dialogue going to kind of like, I mean, try to, you know, advocate your situation, explain what is going on, and having events like this one. I mean, I'm sure there's also people kind of like, I mean, who are getting information from this kind of like webinars. I mean that I think is a very important first step.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good constructive step. And so I want to throw that point of discussion open to first Kieran and then Seamus and Brendan and Roisin, in terms of, Kieran, first your views in terms of how do we get these actors who are familiar with both local policies and the national policies, how do we build stronger connections there? And what was your experience in developing your progress reports in this area?
I found Rüdiger's overview of the situation from the OECD point of view very interesting and very practical, I must say, relating to particularly the opportunities and the challenges. To some degree, I've addressed some of those, and I found an affinity with what he was saying in both my first and second progress report. and I'll be returning to some of these in the report I'm drafting, the third one at the moment. I think, number one, the emphasis on thinking locally, the emphasis on what the strengths of the regions are, which I think I identified in my first report. You cannot, and Rudiger said right, you can't just throw in a whole new state enterprise into a region that hasn't the experience of it and doesn't relate to the region. And we have a certain prevention of that now because of various rules and regulations. But secondly, the issue of the, as I see it, the political interchangeability, the Midland Regional Transition Team at its last meeting had local politicians who were in the local authorities. It had national elected politicians who are the parliamentary representatives for the counties and the constituencies, and we had a number of ministers. So I think that knowledge that Rudiger says, most of our national politicians start as local politicians and they move on. So that knowledge was important, and the Midland region at the moment is particularly advantageous because they have a number of ministers, both at senior and at minister at state level. So I unashamedly have offered the view to Seamus and Roisin and local people, listen, use that forum, lobby that forum. They're a voice either at the cabinet or in their respective departments or in the thing. If you don't look for something, you're not going to get it, and nobody is going to. The other important role, which I'd like to just say, is that I've had a very good and positive engagement with government departments and central government who operate a cluster and a multiplicity of funds that are particularly relevant to the region, and a number of new ones coming about village renewal, local enterprise innovation hubs, utilization of IDA and funding in Enterprise Ireland for advanced factories, the Greenways Fund, the Heritage Fund. There's a lot of the ongoing and new ones been announced of accessing those. And one of what I've been doing in my report is highlighting these. These are funds that can access and are available to local communities with a particularly rural development aspect to them. And I have been, as Just Transition Commissioner, I'm very conscious, having been in the public service for 25 years. You have to sometimes work with what we call the real government, those senior civil servants who have a very influential voice in advocating programs and supporting programs and lobbying for programs in their government budgets. So thankfully, in the Just Transition, we have our own department who have been working closely with me, but they have been working closely with me with all the other government departments who, as part of Just Transition and climate change, are working under the aegis of the Office of the Prime Minister. So I think the points Rudiger make are very, very pertinent.
Yes, I agree. And for those insights too, in terms of what your experience has been, I want to continue with this question with both Seamus and Brendan giving their inputs on how they experience trying to lobby up into at national level from, given their local rootedness. And so if we can address that one briefly, and then I want to come to some other questions that have come in from our chat as well, and I want to see if we still have some time to go to some of those other questions. So Seamus, first I'll turn to you and see if you can add your comments to what Kieran and Rudiger have already talked about. Seamus, I can't hear you yet.
I hope you can hear me now. Thanks, colleagues, again, and to the two presentations as well. Kieran, I can assure you, Irish Rural Link are extremely unashamed at lobbying, as Brendan will tell you as well. We don't seem to have any shame at all. Some would say, in fact, some would say we could do it a bit. But anyway, yeah, I think you're right. I think it is good that that committee is meeting, and it is good that they are making their points at cabinet level. And I suppose in the Community Wetlands Forum, we would say, because it was ironically opened and launched by President O'Higgins, we would make it very clear that to animate the local work, you need the kind of stuff being done by Offaly Local Development, the kind of stuff being done by our local development, our Community Wetlands Forum. And can I say, just as an example, when we started, we had 10 sites members. That's gone to 21, simply because we got some resources to employ a part-time person to try and develop the other sites. And as I said, they are real sites. It's not talking shops, it's real sites. And it's amazing, once the ownership is there, then the local community drive it further themselves. We were involved, as I said, in a lot of the turf transition. And I remember at the last meeting in my own local area, Clarabog, the people who had effectively crossed a lot of Rubicons in terms of change, because effectively they were being driven out of cutting turf in their own area. And that was a big journey that they had to travel in the Clara area. And the last thing they said at a very public meeting in Rahan Hall was, okay, now that we're gone out of the bog as such, don't forget us, because we still want to be part of whatever its next chapter is. And I thought that was a really touching thing to tell us. And I have to say, and I've been apologizing to people in the Clara Island area ever since, because I don't think we've managed to achieve that. Because there, if you look at the Clarabog area, there's a huge potential resource. There's about at least 4 to 5 kilometers of potential walkways around it. It is a uniquely iconic hydrological system of water and flora and fauna, documented not by me, but by world authorities. And I don't think we've taken full advantage of returning the bog to the community in the proper way. The community, in a sense, have kind of left it. It's kind of overgrown, and there's been a lot of good work done in the LIFE project, but the community needs to own it, and they don't yet. So we think that's one member of our group that we think need help.
So you lobby on their behalf. So you and
Yes.
I appreciate that you're saying that you are that unashamed lobbyist on behalf
Yes.
of these groups, and I'm absolutely sure that good work will continue. I want to give Brendan and Roisin a chance to come in here on this in the closing minutes. So Brendan, perhaps you have some thoughts on
Yes.
the question, particular discussion.
I have 3 quick points, and Roisin has 3 quick points to make on that. I think there's a crucial thing that often is missed in this, and that's knowing what you want. And I think that's really important, that at a local level, and I'm talking about this both within the private and the community side of things. And when I say that, I mean that you actually are able to get into the detail of what kind of things you would like to be able to see the support. And I think, Seamus, you've alluded to the role that the communities play in the bogs and the rehabilitation of those bogs outside of Boardnamone, because everybody sees it as Boardnamone's problem. It's not just Boardnamone's problem. There's many others that need to be involved in that. I think you've got to create a meaningful voice for communities, and that's the whole idea of community ownership. We'll beat that drum till I'm sent off to wherever I have to go next, because that's the most important part. If the communities don't own this, you can have all the fora and all the structures and all of the bodies that you like. If this doesn't mean something to communities, and I think the other thing is you've got to put your money where your mouth is. You've got to say, if communities come along with this, and there are a myriad of funds. I mean, I don't think I've ever, in my 30 years of working in development, I've ever seen as much funding. But what happens is that sometimes the funding is out there, but it's not available to community organisations or individuals. It's a renaming of funds that normally came through the public purse. So the town and village renewal money went into footpaths through the local authority 15 years ago. Now it comes through this, and there's a fund called. So I think you've got to look at the investment in that. And just one quick one. We're working with one group who have an idea for a community-owned solar farm, which is probably going to cost about €8 million to develop. And what they need is partners, but they need to be recognised as a partner within that, and the role that they can play within that. Roisin, who I never managed to keep quiet, wants to say a few words as well.
Yes, please, Roisin. And we'll give you almost the closing words in this session here.
Okay, it's just on a very practical level as part of the community planning process. I think it's really important that the community engage early on with the stakeholders who are external to them, be that the OPW, Fáilte Ireland, Waterways Ireland, the local authorities and so on. And that's what we have, at an early stage in their planning, that's what they do, so that, you know what I mean, they get those people on board to see that their policies and their actions are mirroring what's going on in their own policy, in the national policies. The second point I'd like to make is that we've talked about lobbying local elected reps and maybe, I suppose, ministers and so on. In our instance, what we can verify is that most of those are actually volunteers in their own community. So while you're going to them with their hat as an elected representative on, you're also their volunteer within the group that could be sitting around developing these projects. And that's a fortunate way to have it. And I think it's important that we use that, you know what I mean, in its most positive. And I think the third point I'd just like to make is that national policy and local policy is a two-way thing. And I think while local policy certainly must keep in line with national policy should be informed by local policy if we're talking about bottom up. So just to bear that in mind, that, you know, we do need the two-way thing.
So it sounds like from all of the speakers today that we're echoing the need to build better links between those points. So in the closing minute, I'm going to first of all thank all of you for your contributions. Thank all of you for bearing with us during some of the technical challenges. Yes, there were some other important points about connecting skills with jobs, which I think answers some of the questions that were in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to. But dialogue between different strands of government seems to be a key theme that we need to work on, one of the possible next steps that we need to constantly keep in mind. So that, I think we've run out of time. All that remains is for me to thank you once again, to thank the EEAC for hosting this conference, to thank NESC for all its work, and to remind you of the sessions tomorrow with President Michael D. Higgins. I'm sure that will be inspirational, and some follow-on sessions with panelists about the participatory processes and what's next for Just Transition given our COVID reality. So thank you very much to everybody, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the conference. Thank you.